Since last year, many African states have been involved in the conduct of elections. Indeed, many African states have been compliant to democratic political transitions. While periodic elections attest to political development and a major act to prevent democratic reversals, as posited by the liberals, elections in Africa have become ritualistic due to the manipulations of election results, intimidation of the opposition parties, and the absolute denials of people's right to choose their leaders in a free and fair electioneering process. My name is Adeoye Akinola. I'm the head of research and teaching at the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation at the University of Johannesburg. Welcome to today's meeting, which has been organized by the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation in collaboration with the Institute for the Future of Knowledge, both at the University of Johannesburg. The meeting takes a critical reflection of the elections that have been conducted in countries such as Kenya, Nigeria, and Tunisia, and explores the possibilities of deepening representative democracy. The meeting also aims to offer a prophetic analysis of the forthcoming elections in Zimbabwe and South Africa. The events have been divided into two panels, which will run one after the other. There will also be an opportunity for our guests and participants to engage with our reputable panelists who have been carefully selected and the best in their respective academic, social, society, and policy spaces. It is thus my pleasure to welcome the two chairs, Professor Kabele Matlosa and Mr. Terry Selani, and the six panelists who will soon be introduced by the two chairs. Please permit me to hand over to the chair of the first panel, Professor Kabele Matlosa, former Director for Political Affairs of the African Union Commission in Addis Ababa, is also a visiting professor at the Center for African Diplomacy and Leadership and the Senior Research Fellow at the IPATC, both at the University of Johannesburg. Professor Kabele, over to you.
Thank you very much, Oye, our host this afternoon. It's really my pleasure to be part of this important seminar this afternoon. And I don't need to talk about myself. You've introduced myself adequately, and thank you for that. We will kick it off. We don't have a lot of time. The organizers have already indicated to us the time constraints we have. So we'll kick it off with the first panel. The first panel will have three speakers, presenters. I just want to check that they are available. Ms. Cynthia Mbamalu from Yaka, Africa, welcome. And Mr. Mohamed-Dhia Hammami from Tunisia. Let's confirm that he's around. And then Prof. Frederick Ogenga from Kenya, Center for Media, Democracy, Peace and Security in Kenya. And the colleague from who will speak on Tunisia is based at Syracuse, I guess in the US, Syracuse University in the US. And also Madame Cynthia Yaka, Africa in Nigeria. I'm not sure whether it's Lagos or Abuja. You will let us know where you are right now. So that's our panel. That's our panel. Let me just quickly, because we've been. Am I audible? Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Thank you very much. Yes. Let me just give some brief remarks, basically bullet points, because we don't have a lot of time, to set the stage for the first panel. The first bullet point is that Oya has set the stage for us. I want to build on that. Elections are a key ingredient of democracy. There's no doubt about it. Elections are a key ingredient of democracy. However, an election in and of itself does not amount to democracy. So we have to distinguish between democracy and elections, because elections can may promote democracy much the same way that they can shield autocracy. That's number one. Number two, according to the OAUC election calendar of this year, the African Union Commission's elections calendar, there are about 16 presidential and parliamentary elections planned for this year. So let's note that. Three of the three countries we're going to discuss in this first panel, Kenya held its elections in August 2022. And our colleague is going to speak to that in a short while. Tunisia held its first parliamentary election, first round of parliamentary election in December 2022, and its second round in January 2023. Nigeria held its presidential and parliamentary and gubernatorial elections in February and March 2023. Now, fourth bullet point is that all these elections took place within a particular context that I think should inform our discussions. The first is the COVID-19 aftermath, because COVID-19 has had its own peculiar impact on democratization and elections in Africa. Two, the continuing Russia NATO war in Ukraine is a factor that we cannot close our eyes on, because it has impact on livelihoods and the extent to which people then view governance, which leads to the third point. There is currently a rising popular discontent with governance on the continent, which manifests by way of protests, demonstrations. You saw one in South Africa yesterday, and you saw a lot of, actually in all these countries that we're going to discuss, at least the first three, we witnessed popular protests in Nigeria, in Tunisia, and in Kenya. So we need to actually zero in on that as a factor. Now, this then also, this is my last point, This then also helps us to understand that there is a declining public trust in governance institutions. And linked to that, and Afrobarometer has done a lot of work on this, so I'm not really saying something that is new. There's declining public trust in government institutions. Linked to the public trust decline, we are also witnessing loss of citizens' faith in elections. And this one is very interesting. The loss of citizens' faith in elections is very interesting. I'm going to just end with giving you an interesting statistical, depiction of this, of this declining citizens' faith in elections. We'll talk of, we'll look at it from the transitions, democratic transitions in the 90s, and then the last election. Now let's look at Kenya. Kenya, 1992, in terms of voter turnout. 1992 transitional election, the voter turnout was 66.81%. That's Kenya. The latest election, 2022, last year, it dropped from 66.81% to 64.77%. It dropped all the same, but not that major, as you will see with the other two countries. Let's go to Tunisia. Tunisia elections of 1994, which was kind of transitional. 1994, 95.47%. Then the latest one in 2023, early this year, 11.40%, shocking. From 95.47% to 11.40%. Let's look at Nigeria. Nigeria, 1993, a transitional election, 38.90% voter turnout. This particular election, this year, 2023, 26.71%. Now, this statistical information tells us volumes about citizens' participation in the democratic processes and citizens' faith in election, which in my view is dwindling. With those remarks, let me call on my panelists. My panelists, three of them. Where did I put my thing now? Oh, yeah. My apologies. I've already introduced them. So I'm not going to repeat that so that we save time. I'll call on Madam Cynthia Mbamalu, and then he will be followed by Mohamed-Dhia Hammami, and the last panelist to be Prof. Frederick Ogenga. They will be, so their bios will be shown on the screen, so I don't need to read that to you, colleagues. Without further ado, allow me to call on Madam Cynthia Mbamalu, and all of you colleagues, my panelists, let's skip to the time. You have strictly 12 minutes. So I have my colleagues who will be assisting me to time, but I will also time with my own phone, but you can also time yourself. 12 minutes, Madam Cynthia, off you go.
Thank you, and greetings from the Federal Capital Territory, Abuja in Nigeria. And I think I would say it's a huge honor to be part of this conversation. Interestingly, Nigeria, we're still in our elections mood. We just concluded the sub-national elections on Saturday, March 18th. So that is the elections to elect the governors at the state level and the state legislators. We had our presidential elections February 18, the presidential and national parliament elections. And so, I mean, for the governorship elections, we still have elections that are yet to be concluded. Some of them were inconclusive. And it's interesting we're having this conversation now and just following the introduction that has been made already. And I think my reflections would focus on 5 broad issues. The first for me is the fact that the conduct of periodic elections does not equate democracy. It is the means to an end. It's not the end in itself. The second point for me is around declining trust in government and how that impacts quality of participation in the electoral process. And the third point for me is around electoral integrity and how that supports the development of democracy in our country. And the fourth part for me is around the question around the youth question, especially because of the context of Africa, we keep talking around the burgeoning youth population and how that impacts on the process. And the fifth part for me is around electoral justice and how that inspires trust in the system. And perhaps I would connect that to the issues around legitimacy. And so for this conversation today, I started with the first point around elections does not equate democracy. And let's just use the Nigerian, or the conduct of periodic election does not equate the presence of democracy as a means to an end. Ahead of the presidential elections in Nigeria, we had this robust movement for an electoral reform post the 2019 general elections. And the movement led to the passing into law of a new electoral act in 2022, which was signed by the president. And the act did provide specific innovation or provisions that in itself was designed to inspire trust in the system, but guarantee transparency. So things around electoral technology, things around the powers to review results that were declared inconsistent with the law, to limit the influence of the court in the process, things around disability voting, and things around financial independence for the Electoral Commission. These were important provisions that did inspire participation. So post the passage of the law, we had a lot of citizens who felt inspired, and the engagement, especially from the youth population, was quite inspiring in the process. However, getting to the elections, part of what we did observe in the process, which is why I said the elections do not equate the presence of democracy, because democracy in itself is about participation, is about inclusion and representation. Now, in the pre-elections phase, we saw situations where the political party primaries in themselves were so exclusionary that it went to the highest bidder. So the cost of nomination closed up the space. And in Nigeria, to contest election, you need to ride or you need to contest on the platform of a political party. And so when you have political parties giving high cost of nominations running into millions of naira, what this meant was that only those who had the big money bags behind them, or only those who had huge sums of money, could even contest in the primaries level. It closed up the space and limited the options for participation. And that's one point. So the fact you're having periodic election did not mean it was very inclusive or participatory. Now, the other thing we began to see in the pre-elections phase was a trend of electoral violence we further saw playing out on elections day, which resulted in the incidences of voter intimidation and voter suppression on elections day. So you can imagine a campaign season where the campaign is driven by campaign of calumny and hate speech, especially hate speech driven based on religious and ethnic sentiments. And Nigeria is a multi-ethnic nation and religious diverse nation. And so when it comes to campaigns, you see a lot of rhetorics around ethnic identity, religious identity, and that continued to play through with the rhetorics from the political class leading into the elections. And now, so if I want to bring this to the elections day context, actually for the national elections that we had, part of our observation as an organization, we deployed observers. Now, part of what we had, we had observed in the pre-elections phase was that the closed space for campaigns would affect how citizens engage the process, but that also issues around the quality of the process could either inspire trust or limit participation in the process. And so on elections day, regardless of the new law that gave INEC the power, the Electoral Commission the powers to assess their funds on time to plan better, the Nigerian elections recorded late commencement across board with poor logistics management. Now, logistics management in the sense that we had polling units where some voters were not allowed to vote, polling units where elections did not hold, and even locations where the elections materials were insufficient. So you can imagine that you had the interest with the electoral law and its increase in participation, but then on elections day, you had voters who turned out but couldn't vote. You had locations where voting went on till early hours of the following day. People spent over 20 hours to vote. So that's one point. But now the conversation around the quality of the process became a major issue, because for the legal framework in elections in Nigeria, you have the electoral law, you have the guidelines, but you had situations where sections of the guidelines were set aside by the Electoral Commission on elections day, especially sections around results management, which was empowered with the new innovation in the Electoral Act and enabling the Commission to electronically transmit results. But you had that particular section not applied and applicable. So immediately it created doubts on the process. So, I mean, we had an elections, but incidences where voters could not vote, not for any fault of theirs, but on the failure of the Electoral Commission to plan properly, and then coupled with locations where we had violence. So that would be the first point I have. The other point around the declining trust and how it affects participation. Now, Nigeria sadly has recorded low turnout, almost a declining turnout in voters with successive elections. 2019 presidential elections, voter turnout was at 35%. Now, there was a lot of effort to inspire trust in the process. And the expectation was that with the new law, with new oversight systems to checkmate malpractices, that you would have, yes.
Sorry, my sister, we have 6 minutes left.
Yes, that you'd have more participation. However, what we did see, the process were first by the pre-elections phase, the quality of the campaigns and the challenges on elections day. We recorded lower turnout in this election. These elections recorded about 27% turnout of voters for the presidential elections. And now, so you had locations where large number of voters couldn't get to vote because of the challenges with elections administration. But what this has done post the elections, if you follow the conversation, was the fact that there was already the trust deficit. So regardless of the data from Afrobarometer, which showed that 71% of Nigerians trusted that elections was a credible way to elect leaders, but the data also showed that people did not trust the process would deliver credible elections or that their votes would count. So already the challenges experienced on elections day What it further did was created a level of disinterest amongst voters to even participate. So you had people who couldn't wait for the voting process to commence, and they just went back home because of frustration waiting to get their votes to count. And post that elections, a lot of conversation has been on the fact that a lot of Nigerians do not trust the process and are indicating their lack of interest to even participate and engage. Now, the question around electoral integrity is key for me because it's beyond just having periodic elections. If the quality does not guarantee that legitimate governments are elected, if the process itself does not guarantee that the votes count, it affects the engagement of citizens post the elections. And for the lessons from Nigeria, integrity of the process is critical in supporting the move for democracy in Nigeria. Increasingly, you have citizens questioning the process. And when you have a process that seems to lack transparency, it affects how Nigerians or how citizens engage the process. And we've seen this happen in the governorship elections. So the elections of Saturday, March 18, for instance, post the presidential elections, recorded larger incidents of voter intimidation, locations where thugs just took over the process and voters we lost voters to that process, lots of casualties and violence and intimidation. And what that basically has done is to question the outcome of elections in several states. So as I'm speaking, there are protests in different states in the country questioning the outcome of the elections in some of the states. And you can see that that level of grievance in itself affects even the legitimacy of the governors who were elected and the current president who is the current president-elect. The third and the fourth point for me is around the youth question. And I think it's a general question for the continent Africa. Increasingly, you're having a lot of young people losing interest in democracy, lots of young people questioning the concept of democracy or even the value of their citizenship. And I believe that it begins with how the process is credible, how the process is inclusive to ensure the voices of youth are represented. And for me, this is a major threat if young people begin to lose interest in democracy or if young people begin to seek for alternatives to democracy. We could see trends of coup within the region, within the West African sub-region. And sadly, we had some of those countries where young people were celebrating the military takeover in those countries. And it raises the question around the value of democracy. If young people do not feel that democracy is delivering its dividends, we are increasingly seeing lower voter turnout, lower participation in government, and lower youth representation in government. And from the experience from Nigeria, if you have younger people questioning their concept of democracy, it creates a threat because if young people begin to take arms against the state, it becomes a more difficult issue to address. So for me, the youth question remains critical in how we solidify and consolidate on the supposed gains of democracy in our country. And the fifth point for me is around electoral justice and how it impacts on political stability. And for me, electoral justice, I would connect that to the roles of the court. We're increasingly seeing the courts play an important role in our elections. If you follow the Kenyan elections last year, we saw the role the Supreme Court played in that elections in delivering its judgment and its emphasis on the sovereignty of the people of Kenya as paramount to any other political interest. And I think for the Nigerian experience, a major question around the independence of the judiciary, because now we have politicians there's a common mantra now, politicians say you rig at the process and you go to courts, because increasingly there's a trend of politicians buying their way through the courts and buying judgment. So now votes are not concluded or decided at the polling units, but concluded in court. And most times there is no guarantee on how the court will determine the outcome. And if people do not feel that they achieve electoral justice, it also creates disaffection on how they engage the process. And I think that this is also a lesson from Nigeria, especially as a lot of the cases post these elections are currently in court. Most of the candidates and the oppositions are in court already, challenging the outcome at both the national and state level. And we're looking forward to see how the courts will determine the outcome of these particular elections. I'll cede the floor now, and I hope we'll have more robust conversation. Thank you.
Excellent, my sister. I really appreciate the very rich input you've made. If we were in a physical seminar, I would have asked the participants to give you a round of applause, really, frankly. A very rich discussion you have shared with us. Very good five key messages that will come back to during discussion and also closing the session. Allow me to then call on, thanks Cynthia, you were spot on time, right on time. And then I'll request the second speaker to please, follow the same footsteps of Cynthia in terms of respecting the 12 minutes, please. Mr. Hammami, please.
So I think to understand the electoral dynamic, it's important to put it in the broader context, as you said earlier. So most people think of Tunisia as this country that faced what is often called the Arab Spring. So I wanted to introduce first to political scene quickly to people who are not familiar with it. So it's based on a highly networked but very fragmented at the organizational level. At the individual level as well, it's highly connected. The military has been historically isolated, but during the last years, we saw the development of individual level connections with politicians who were in power since the fall of Ben Ali's regime in 2011. Same thing, they are embedded in the broader power network composed of corporate elites. So since 2011, we had a large number of cabinets, which reflects the type of political system that we had, the kind of more parliamentary system. But what's I think more important is that aside from the short experience of the Islamist-led coalition, we had an old regime coalition that was in power since 2015, and that somehow is disappointing for the Tunisian people who did participate in the revolution to kind of make things change. And so we saw, as a result, a decline of the president cabinet trust gap, as you can see in this chart. People started having less and less trust in the executive, but that also happened for the legislative. So starting from the 2014 elections, we started seeing the rise of what we call the independent list, people who are not affiliated to any political parties, because people were disillusioned by this kind of pact that is often thought as a facilitator of democratization that initially came from studies of Latin American experience. And then progressively, we saw the rise of other actors who tend to have a more populist, and by here populist meaning is neither ideological nor programmatic kind of agenda. And simultaneously, the economic situation became really bad. So if you just see these two indicators, the ability to get food, or people running out of food without being able to get more, this is data from the Arab Barometer. Tunisia had by 2019, half of the population were somehow in that situation. But the main concern of Tunisians since 2012, and I'm using here the International Public Health Institute data, was mostly about creation of jobs. And none of the economic policies adopted since then, including those promoted by the World Bank and the IMF, were focusing on that top priority. And simultaneously, we also saw a decline in the satisfaction with the health system. So when the COVID crisis was at its peak and the number of deaths was very high, one of the highest in the continent during end of July, we saw President Qais Said declaring the suspension of the parliament in what we often portray as a self-coup, meaning a coup that is led by an incumbent president against the other branches of the parliament. And that was deemed and so this self-coup was deemed by the African Courts of Human Rights and Human People's Rights as being unconstitutional, but the President Qais Said did not comply. But the problem is that the perception of the economic situation Initially, right after the coup, it did increase. So we can see how there is a difference here between the evaluation of the current economic situation and the kind of optimism. People are more optimistic about the next following 2 or 3 years. And now the 2 or 3 years are here, and again, they overlapped, and the economic situation actually went worse. There was initially an important split between political parties on whether or not to support the coup, and also to support the later decision that was made by the president, which has to do with the suspension of the constitution and moving toward a new constitutional order. And so the few parties that supported were more radical and populist, coming from marginal fringes of the historical Tunisian left, with the Arab nationalists and the kind of old Marxist-Leninist Maoist political party. Among the popular base of these parties, we also saw a split across these political parties. Even the Sha'bi, one of the examples of the pro-coup parties, half of the voters did not really support the coup. But an important point here that we should take in consideration is the importance of the rhetoric deployed in post-coup situation to delegitimize the previous elections. So the perception of elections as being fair, free and fair is not only the result of the practice of election itself, but it's also the result of the way incumbents talk about them. So here in the Afrobarometer that was conducted right before the coup, we saw a significant level of support. Most Tunisians, around 80%, 75% of Tunisians deemed the elections of 2019 as free and fair. But in October 2021, meaning only 3 months after the coup, we saw a significant decline and rise of more skepticism and a total rejection of the elections being free or fair. And so Said now is presenting a new kind of political project that is based on what he called the local councils. The problem that he's facing is the disengagement of people from the support of his party. So initially, he ran an online consultation on his political project. Yes.
Yes, 6 minutes, please.
Yes, I think I'll be able to finish before 6 minutes.
Great.
So when he ran an online consultation, he got only 5% of the Tunisian population participating. 30% showed up to the polls about the new constitution, and in both rounds of the legislative election, we had one of the lowest rates of participation in post-World War II era, with only 11%. And when we look at the distribution as well, we see that geographical areas where there are mostly highly populated, where we find concentration of more educated Tunisians for historical reasons, and also urbanization and others, relatively high level of concentration, but people who were historically differentialized and marginalized did not actually participate. The level of participation in the southern part and the interior region that is closer with Algeria was no more than 4%, and with even like around 1% in the south. And those who were running in the new legislative elections were mostly between 40 and 54%, which is also different than much higher than the base of people who are in the 20s and 30s who did mobilize for Said in preparation for his coup and for his election in 2019. And this level of disengagement, we also see it through other indicators that don't have to do with showing to the polls, but even paying attention to the elections. And we can see that through the Google searches in comparison with the previous elections starting from 2011, and the media attention as well, as we can see in this graph. The general election of 2019 or the municipal election, which usually attracts more or less attention, at the media level attracted more attention than the referendum and the legislative elections of 2022. So it's not only about being a disinterest in voting, but it's a disinterest in the political process at all, because it's not seen as meaningful, let's say. And thank you.
Mr. Hammami, excellent presentation and very rich discussion as well. Prof, over to you. Welcome. Karibu sana.
Yes, Kavele, nice to see you, Prof. I remember the last time we met at the AU headquarters.
Wonderful, cheers. And then over to you. Go ahead, and 12 minutes, my brother, please.
Okay, well, for lack of time, I'll just take you very quickly about what I want to talk about. I just basically want to talk about three very important issues as far as African democracy or democracies in Africa is concerned, and its future predicament or prospects. One of those issues would be, of course, we're using the case of Kenya. One of those issues would be institutional designs for democracy. The other one would be elections and electoral infrastructure. And the last one would be the media, also related to one of the institutions that should be there to really safeguard and promote democracy. But I'll first of all give you a brief history of Kenyan democratic journey. Kenya democratic journey, of course, has been characterized by periodic elections, which have been chaotic in a sense. Chaotic in a way that defines what the Kenya's political class has been, how the Kenyan political class has been positioning themselves vis-a-vis the discourses that they use to consolidate power. And one of the things that come to the fore is actually ethnicity. So from 1991, when Kenya repealed Section 2A to usher in multi-party democracy, we've seen competitive politics with different parties coming up. But the only problem has been that this journey has been littered with a competition that is based on ethnic allegiances. So there is on one side competition based on ethnic allegiances, and on the other side, an institutional design, a system of governance that is not really favorable for multi-ethnic societies like Kenya. And this design is what would call a presidential system of governance. So this presidential system of governance, which some scholars will call it the winner takes it all, has been actually a burden in the Kenyan political landscape. And we have witnessed a lot of violence because of this, where those who lose elections really positions themselves as losers, and they perhaps cause chaos and violence because they feel no longer part of Kenya, as it were. So that has been a problem. And this is a problem that has been a challenge over the years. And we saw increasingly Kenyans beginning to see how they can come up with an institutional design of democracy that can be favorable in multi-ethnic societies. In some quarters, they call it negotiated democracy. And negotiated democracy in Kenya has manifested itself through what we call, first of all, it was the National Accord that was mediated by Kofi Annan after Kenya went through a serious post-election violence in 2007, 2008, and brought in the position of the Prime Minister. Things became calm. In fact, in that era, that's when Kenya recorded almost double-digit growth in terms of the economy, and things were great. The only thing that happened later, there was a missed opportunity to institute this design that was brought out of the first handshake, that brought peace and stability. So having missed that opportunity, we saw a recurrence of violence, We saw this ethnic competition postponed to 2013. We witnessed a lot of ethnic affiliated parties confronting each other and citizens fighting along party lines, but these are just ethnic sentimental parties. And then we also witnessed that in 2017, which led to the nullification of an election. But of course, we also saw Kenyans positioning themselves along ethnic lines. And therefore, post-2017 election, there was a serious discussion after that election was disputed and the opposition boycotted those elections on how Kenya should move forward in terms of its governance or system of governance. And that brought about another handshake, courtesy of Uhuru Kenyatta and Raila Odinga, and they agreed to come up with something called the Building Bridges Initiative, which was born out of consulting people in people's assemblies. Of course, there was a battle to legalize this again, and it was debated in the county assemblies in Kenya, but it failed. Later on, it actually failed because the court ruled that it was unconstitutional, and a sitting president cannot institute constitutional changes. So it was thrown out. And therefore, we find ourselves in 2022 with the same precarious situation where we see ethnic alliances. And again, we have this winner takes it all situation and another problematic election, which actually went to court and it was thrown away. So as we speak today, we are seeing the opposition going back to the streets because the streets have been used as those spaces where people ventilate themselves in terms of the loser. You know, the losers have lost everything. They've lost opportunities. They've lost their identity. They've lost their inclusivity and all those things. So they feel helpless and hopeless in the context of what the chair talked about earlier of a post-COVID-19 situation and a problematic food security situation characterized by climate change and the war in Ukraine. So citizens are feeling disillusioned. So what should we do in this context? So my argument here is that perhaps we need to give a chance and an opportunity for an African institutional design, which we are beginning to see through this model of the handshake. Because the handshake brings in, it's some sort of negotiated concessional democracy, where people come together and they agree, this is how we want to compete and this is how we want to govern. This opportunity is always lost, and then it always often leads to violence. So we have a situation like that today, where we're beginning to see different voices, the clergy, the civil society, other political affiliations trying to encourage Raila Odinga and William Ruto, who are actually friends. They've competed once in 2007. They were in the same camp to sit together and see how we want to move as Kenyans. But that is not the problem. So having missed an opportunity to come up with a good institutional design that can determine how Kenya will be managed democratically going forward or governed, then we need to interrogate some of these institutions that are there to support democracy. And all these institutions have not been doing well. The judiciary has not been doing well, courtesy of the Supreme Court. The executive has not been doing well, capturing the law enforcers and other democratic support systems. The electoral agencies, IEBC, has not been doing well. And this has been the worst because this is where the competition is. So the IEBC, as a referee, has adopted a system that is born out of an electronic system that is a foreign system. And this system has failed in terms of how they want it to manifest in the Kenyan elections. And we are seeing, do I still have time?
6 minutes, yes.
Yeah, so we are seeing Kenya procuring a integrated electoral management system that is supposed to identify voters and also transmit results. But the problem that this system has been infiltrated because it is designed by foreign companies which have got an alliance with the powers that be on the ground, one of the competitors in the elections. And this alliance has ensured that elections are not transparent. And of course, there have been allegations of vote tampering and faulty voter registers that are not accurate. And of course, this has related to contentious elections. So the argument is that are we witnessing a situation where there's a democratic decay, where leaders are forced through our throat through electronic election mechanisms that are manufactured elsewhere and are used in Kenya for the sake of installing puppet regimes? And these regimes apparently would be those that speak the tunes of Western and other allies. And this has been a serious concern in Kenya, where we are now seeing ideas of LGBT coming in and creeping in through our judicial systems and being legalized or legitimatized at the expense of the cultures on the ground. We are also witnessing a situation where genetically modified organisms are being accepted in the country so that Kenya could be one of those markets for multinational companies that seek to sell genetically modified organisms to Kenyans at the expense of Kenyans' health and also at the expense of our climate and our genetic, our indigenous seeds. So we are seeing a lot of these things coming in forcefully, where people are disagreeing with those kinds of conversations. But again, those ones who are sitting in State House are seemingly entertaining these views. So is it that now today we have elections as just a formality, a procedure that is a formality that is meant to hoodwink us, that we are actually exercising our rights through the vote, yet we are just being manipulated through systems that we don't know how they work? So what is the solution? Well, the solution is not far away. Part of it is to actually revert back to manual systems of voting. Because really, what we have witnessed as scholars in the Kenyan elections is that they just use the electronic system to identify voters and to transmit results. Meanwhile, you are given physical ballots and you cast your votes, and these ballots are counted physically. So if they would have a system where you vote manually and you devolve the electoral body so that it's not centralized in one location in Nairobi, because election results are manipulated when they are being transmitted through these systems that are born and are bought from foreigners. And of course, this is where things get manipulated. So if you devolve elections, for example, where I'm speaking from Migori County, and you have an electoral body that will oversee elections in Migori County. So elections in Migori County from constituency level to parliamentary level to presidential level will be concluded at the grassroots level. And there's this idea of transmitting results elsewhere would not be existing. And in that case, I think we can begin to have a very credible system of voting that will be reflective of the views of the ordinary citizens. But as it is today, it's not the case. And finally, we are also seeing the media presenting another complicated situation. And I'm not talking about the mainstream media alone. I'm even talking about social media today. Social media in Kenya has been increasingly used as an avenue for ethnic polarization, misinformation, disinformation, fake news, and of course, that spills offline and becomes another recipe for violence. So what is it that we can do about media spaces, both mainstream and social media spaces, so that the media can be used as one of those avenues that can speak about the reforms that are necessary, especially during the electioneering time and post-elections? And of course, generally, in terms of safeguarding the democratic space to ensure that democracy is manifesting itself in an organic and genuine manner, and not a cosmetic manner where we have leaders that we did not choose, yet they are there determining our lives, and there's nothing we can do about it.
Thank you, my brother. Thank you, Prof. Excellent, excellent, excellent. Actually, we've come to the end of it. I would like to thank our panelists. And actually, there's a story that would summarize all the concerns raised by my three panelists. This story was shared to me by one of African scholars, political economists, the late Tandika Mkandawire of Malawi. He said that, elections elsewhere, they denote a moment for citizens, for voters to choose leaders. And then he said, this is the conventional definition elsewhere. But in Africa, we've twisted the definition. In Africa, instead of elections being a moment for voters to choose leaders, it is actually a moment for leaders to choose voters. So I think listening to all the presenters, that they are actually questioning, the essence of elections to democracy and the extent to which actually the leaders we get as a result of elections are a choice of voters. This is why Mkandawire then spoke, at length about what he called choiceless democracies, because during elections, it's leaders that choose voters, not voters choosing leaders. This is how I'll summarize the session, really, without any further ado. We'll get into discussions just now. Let me check my time. We are going to 5 minutes to 4 Southern African time. So we have to go up until 4:30. So which means we have like 40 minutes to have discussions. I'll ask my colleagues to assist me to check on the hands that will go up. We encourage our participants to raise their hands and participate, directly by raising your point, and also put your mic on as well as your video so that we can see you. But where you are unable to do that, please feel free to use the chat room to put on your question and answer, or chat room to pose your questions. We'll be checking on the hands as well as the chat room as well at the same time. So let me see if there's anything in the chat room as I wait for hands. Okay, I see Francis Chadi.
Yeah, I'm speaking as someone who has witnessed a recent election.
Yes, are you able to put on your video or not?
The network will be poor.
No problem at all. Go ahead, my brother. It's fine.
So I'm speaking as someone who has witnessed the election in Nigeria.
Francis,
I was also
yes.
part of the voter.
Go ahead.
So the election participation in Nigeria recently has dropped because of the collation effect, which is one of the things that one of the presenters hit on. At the local level, people are able to see that their votes are reflecting their position. But once it's moved to the next level of summation, the tendency to have it manipulated is there. So I think it goes to show that the point that devolving the electoral process will be the way to go, considering the fact that centralization is almost not going to fit the democratic pattern of today, when we already have technology that can take care of the decentralization. So the reason for centralization was to manage costs. But now we're actually doing the inverse, centralizing when it is costing us more. So the suggestion would be to go the path of decentralizing.
Decentralization.
Decentralizing and go for immediacy, rather than the calling of the result for a presidential election took some days because of this centralization.
Fantastic. Very, very clever, brother. And I think that point actually it echoes a similar observation from Professor Ogenga from Kenya. So we take your point. Decentralization of the entire electoral process to enhance the integrity of the process itself, as well as the legitimacy of its outcomes. Next speaker. who is on the line? Mpumi, are you able to assist me from that end? I'm not seeing
yes,
hands.
Prof. No raised hands at the moment, but we have quite a few questions in the chat box.
Okay, let's check the question in the chat box. Anyone that comes up quickly?
Okay, so we have one by Lerato who says, what would Prof, assuming he's referring to Prof. Ogenga, envision this institutional design that mirrors the handshake looking like? What are its virtues and attributes? We have another from Shengi.
May I request, sorry, may I request my panelists to please take notes of those questions?
Yes, the panelists should also be able to see the questions in the chat as well.
In the chat room, yes.
Yes.
Go ahead.
The next question from Shengiwe Dube says, please, to all the panelists, please comment on the deployment of technology in achieving election integrity. I might be missing a few, apologies, colleagues. We have a comment from Kenosi, who says the reason to have declining elections and declining trust is the hope from African people is that African people are not monitored and managed. Apologies, I think I might have mixed that up a bit. And then the last question from Dr. Aba says, thank you so much for the fascinating presentations. And his question is, what is the best way of creating electoral integrity in Africa?
Excellent. So those are the questions. And then as we're waiting for hands, if we don't get hands, we'll go back to our panelists. But I wanted to just, since we have a bit of time, to just refresh our minds on the key messages that our panelists have raised. The three of them, starting with Cynthia, so that we can generate some more discussion as the colleagues are still pondering on the questions they want to pose or comments they want to make. And by the way, we're not just about the questions. You can also make a comment, please. Feel free. This is our meeting. Now, with Cynthia raised 5 key points. One point that she built on was around elections, the election democracy nexus. So the interface between elections and democracy, 1. 2, she raised the question around declining public trust and dwindling voter turnout. 3, she raised the point around electoral integrity, in a big way, electoral integrity, the integrity of the electoral process, which then also determines the legitimacy of the outcome. 4, she raised the question around the youth question, the youth in elections. And I think on that window, we can actually even open up the envelope to talk about other, vulnerable and marginalized social groups, such as women, people with disabilities, et cetera, et cetera. So that's an envelope that we can actually open up on the youth to include other social groups. The 5th and final point she raised, which also links to integrity again, is electoral justice. Electoral justice. So she raised those points. Hammami raised very interesting and pertinent points also in the case of Tunisia, historical role of the military. So the military has an important role to play in African politics. What is that role? Does that role enhance democracy or undermine democracy? 1. 2, he also raised the question, like Cynthia, about declining public trust in government. 3, the rise of independent candidates. Let's remember the current president came through that route of an independent candidate. He is a law professor, Kais Said. He's a law professor in a way. I'm not quite sure you'll know better whether he is actually linked to political establishments in the country. The 4th is the rise of populist parties. Rise of populist parties. The other point, the economic situation and its impact on the economic situation and its impact on the governance system in the country. And you also raised the question around participation, the low levels of participation in the country. And you also showed us that table on participation, in the referendum, in the election, which was a very interesting demonstration. Now, the question And he also reminded us of the impact of COVID-19. Now, the question that we need to ponder is whether what's going on in Tunisia since Kais took over, does that enhance democratization or undermine democratization, building a foundation for autocracy? That's the question that I think we need to ponder. Prof. Ogenga raised interesting issues around 3 clusters. One cluster was on institutional design, questioning the current design, the winner-take-all system, presidential design, that is not suitable for a multi-ethnic society like Kenya. And I think he has an important point. And then he made a proposal that maybe to address this, we need to go consociational democracy route, how he calls negotiated democracy. That's consociationalism. So then Kenya could, toy around that idea of power sharing arrangements, coalition governments, negotiated settlements. So that's one set of discussion that he introduced. And then he also said maybe the handshake, the Raila Uhuru handshake, golden handshake, could be one model to think around. Second, he spoke about electoral infrastructure, that maybe even the electoral system, the design, it needs to be revisited. This first past the post, winner-take-all electoral system is not serving Kenya, favorably. Maybe there is need to move towards a proportional system of sorts, so that you address the multi-ethnic, complexion of the society. Finally, he zeroed in on the media, and this is again another important. Well, before the media, technology. Technology. He raised an important point, and I think this is a pertinent point, not only for Kenya, but for the entire continent. Technology is now becoming the voter in Africa. Technology is replacing the voter in determining outcome of elections. What do we do about this? Frankly, people are being disempowered by technology, which has its own interests embedded in those that supply it from abroad. How do we handle this? It's now technology is becoming part of regime change schemes in Africa. It's a fact. So we need to confront this. And then he talked about the media, both traditional and social media. That this media, if they are not responsible enough, they are able to fan electoral violence, through misinformation, disinformation, fake news, etc., etc. So these are my panelists, really. This is what they did. And I wanted just to thank them and summarize in a nutshell what they've shared with us, since I'm still waiting for hands, and then call on hands to intervene. Let's have hands. And then my panelists, don't hurry to come in. We'll give you the last bite at the end of the discussions. Let me know if there are hands. I can see one.
Yes, we have one.
Yes.
And another one as well. We have 2. I think this
Hello,
will be the second question from Francis.
Yes, let's take the hand, please. Yes, who is it?
Francis Chadi.
Francis, you've just spoken. Let's give the other one a chance, please. Didn't you intervene earlier on? Francis? Oh. Let's have another hand, and then Francis will come after that one, please. Francis?
Okay. Can I continue?
Yes, please go ahead. Is that Kenosi?
Oh, yes.
Please go ahead.
Okay. My name is Kinoshi Maropola from South Africa, Limpopo province. But now I'm in Gauteng. I'm studying at University of Johannesburg.
Welcome.
I'm doing politics and communications.
Excellent.
So what I'm rising on is that like Facebook, like Facebook app is not like working like for us. To back up my point is that it's in their culture, in their culture. So like as Africans, I feel like we need maybe a technological factor that will be in our culture. because it's not helping us. Like for example, like we understand we understand in different way, and like we have like when it comes to like education, like we differ. So like as Facebook is from West, it was like what I can say, like it was done looking looking Americans, like looking like Western people, like how they is their education, how they are educated, their understanding. So as when you look in Africa, like people use it, like most people use it for messaging, like posting. And Facebook, what I understand about it, it was made for business. But us here, like we use it like for messaging, for posting, like maybe nonsense things. So as I was saying that like as Africans, we need monetization, and like we need management. Like we need to do something. We need to create something that will be able like to manage people and to monitor people, so that maybe we can know like the culture of our people, so we can like we can be able like to manage them, like to like to monitor them with such technology. Yeah.
Thanks, Kinosi. I think you're raising an important point. Francis earlier on proposed he proposed that we move towards decentralization of the electoral process, devolution of the electoral process. Now you are also proposing that we need to look carefully and critically into the role of Facebook. And I think you're making an important point, and others have already questioned how this technology actually is influencing election outcomes. Francis?
Yes, I'm impressed with the point that was made about how technology is trying to displace the voter in electoral decisions. And I will align you to another point which I've raised earlier, I mean in the chat, that we are also having this tendency of having the judiciary replace the electoral body in some election, because the judgment that gives the candidates clearance as winner is mostly judged on technicalities, which means the voters' interests are not represented adequately when the matters are pushed to the judiciary and the judgment is judged based on technicality that does not reflect the people who give the mandate.
Yes.
So just as we must be cautious of the influence of technology in displacing the voter, we must also be cautious of the judiciary almost usurping the power of the sovereignty of the people.
Absolutely, absolutely. In fact,
the electoral adjudication
that's
on
correct.
Technical ground, and sometimes, if not most times, subverting the will of the people.
Absolutely, you're right, Francis. And I think the two presentations, and almost all the presentations, touched on the role of the judiciary, and in particular in Kenya and Nigeria. We have to be mindful of the problem here, that much as we always recommend that all electoral disputes be resolved through legal channels, we also have to be mindful of a danger of what is called now in the literature, the current literature, what we call judicialization of politics and politicization of the judiciary. Now, so you find a situation where the judiciary, takes over, as you say, Francis, from the EMB, and then decisions are also influenced from elsewhere outside the courts. This is the case to a large extent in Nigeria and Kenya to some extent, and in Tunisia, it didn't actually happen in that way. The president literally, what's the word? Asphyxiated the judiciary. because he fired, a large chunk of the court judges. So I think that's an important point that we shouldn't lose sight of. We're running out of time. Can we get more hands, Pumi?
Yes, Prof, we have one hand from Omosefe.
That should be the last hand, yes. Yes, who is it?
Omosefe, you can proceed.
Omosefe, please.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Hear you, yes.
Great. Good afternoon. My name is Omosefe Oyikomi from the Nigerian Institute of Social and Economic Research in Ibadan, Nigeria. So I would just like to add my voice from the angle of institutional design. And I would like to say that beyond what design and structure that African governments and of course Nigeria initiates, that what is more important in my thinking is the rule of law. Now, using the Nigerian election, the recent election, both the presidential and gubernatorial elections, we could tell that there was already an established, the Electoral Act of 2022 that was passed that had to, that's actually addressed the transmission of the election results, the collation and transmission of results. And it was evident that the entire process, there were issues with the process and not necessarily the outcome. So the process was challenged. And to this end, most of the laws that were stipulated were not followed regarding hate speech and the like. So I'm saying, if you look at the Nigerian and most African situation, even the Kenya situation, in fact, coincidentally, I watched the video of the handshake today, and I was moved emotionally. Yes, but beyond the emotional, beyond that, we need a more structured. I don't know how to put it. The rule of law where people do not just abuse power arbitrarily, because the laws were clearly defined as to how the elections were to be collated and even transmitted using the technology. Now, but along the line, this was not followed. And this, of course, raised a lot of issues. So I'm just saying that even taking the issues to the court or having any form of institutional design, we might be back to the same issues if we do not actually find out how the rule of law can actually be upheld within the African and, of course, the Nigerian political dynamics. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mustafa. Institutionalized constitutionalism and rule of law. Now I'm handing over to my panelists to wind it up. Just give your, brief responses to the questions that are directed to you, and then your closing, takeaways. Briefly. We have 15 minutes to go. So each one of you take 3 minutes, so that we can wrap it up. 3 minutes each, please. Let's go by reverse order. Let's start with Prof.
Oh, yeah. Well, thank you so much. I would want to pick it up from where my sister from Nigeria has brought it up. And this aligns with the question of how do we envision this institutional design? Well, I would want to say that we are experimenting it in Kenya. In Kenya today, our constitution, the first chapter talks about the sovereignty of the people. And the sovereignty of the people supersedes the constitution. So in other words, even the Supreme Court of Kenya is inferior to the people of Kenya, and it can be revisited. And now that is why the opposition now has run around with what we call people's assemblies to find out the views and bring back the power to the people so that they can reorganize those institutions. So that is a good way to go. But generally, the institutions should be those that capture the histories and aspirations of the people of Kenya as Africans, and come up with not a copy and paste a methodology of instituting democracy, but designing democracy like a designer of a cloth will design a cloth that fits, so that we don't blame the wearer of the clothes, but the designer himself. So we don't want to use Western neoliberal concepts of democracy if they are not working for Africa. And on the role of technology, I would propose that we encourage innovation so that we can have our own homegrown technological solutions to our electoral needs, so that we don't have to import technology, and have people with integrity behind technology, because technology is manipulated by people. People are behind technology. So if people fail, the technology will fail. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Well done, my brother. You spoke for just 1.5 minutes. If my other panelists could do the same, please, we'll save more time. Let's get to Hammami, please. Hammami.
Yes, thank you. So I wanted to go back on a few points. I think that institution design does matter, but it's insufficient, in the sense that when we usually talk about institution design, we talk about formal institutions, legal regulations, organizations that are described in the Constitution and composed of individuals who act according to certain clearly written rules. But what we know from the literature, from the most recent literature, that this is insufficient for democracy to survive in hard places, where especially there are critical shocks like COVID, for example. And here, what scholars have been suggesting recently is the importance of norms that should be internalized, in the sense that when we talk about respect of mandates or respect of democratic processes, people need to understand that, need to internalize that and accept that, because sometimes institutions fail to guarantee the persistence of democratically elected government. And that's something that we saw in Tunisia when the constitution, the only constitutional article on the state of emergency was written in a blurry way. So the military did not really understand, or at least that's the argument they present, not understand what was acceptable or what was not. Was it better to simply comply to what the commander-in-chief does, even if it's anti-democratic, or consider the parliament as well as a source of civilian control and preserve it and prevent the president take over all powers? And what we know from the literature on civil-military relations in this situation, that does matter in the African continent, because 2021 was the we had 5 coups plus 1 self-coup, in total 6, which is the highest number of coups in 1 year since the early 1990s. So these kind of institutions that are critical to the survival of democracy don't have to do with what we often attribute to the will of the people, and cannot be preserved by simple institutional design. But to make it short, we need to work more on the cultural part and making our democratic institutions, or people who are governing and have substantial amount of power, truly believe in democracy, instead of taking sometimes risk that can be driven by just temporary and short-run change of preferences, like COVID again is a great example. And what we also need to understand is that we should, countries that manage to succeed in development and in establishing democracies are countries that manage to learn from other countries' successful experiences, and not countries that were willing to engage in extremely risky experiences like President Qais Said is doing now, which is leading us to autocracy. And thank you.
Thank you so much. Cynthia, please.
Yes, thank you. I'll start with the question on technology. I do believe that technology does not automatically guarantee integrity. In fact, technology is supposed to enable the process of transparency. And for me, when it comes to technology, three things are important. First, issue around ownership. And I'm glad Prof made the mention around that. Ownership, can the people take ownership of the process? Are the people part of the consultation to design a technology that they all adapt and agree to? The other part for me is around the principles of transparency and integrity in the adaptation of the technology for the process. And the third and the most important is if technology is introduced to address a problem and not create more problems. And I think that is where a lot of questions around electoral technology has come up from our own electoral process, because a lot of people were inspired with the technology, and I'll connect this to the question of collation. Technology was supposed to promote transparency in the results collation process in Nigeria, but for the presidential elections, that particular innovation was set aside. And so a lot of people felt that such an innovation that was homegrown and a lot of people celebrated ahead of the elections was now something that was sidestepped on elections day. And so that would be my thoughts on technology. The conversation around the judicialization of politics, as Prof put it. Now, in Nigeria, beginning to see an increasing role of the court in our elections. And sadly, there is no guarantee on how courts determine issues. As some of the, Francis mentioned, most times decisions are made based on technicalities. We have a governor in a particular state whom the voters in the state call the Supreme Court governor, because even as observers and experts in the elections, none of us could understand the interpretation of the court that led to the emergence of that governor as a governor, because the court became a collation office. And the question is, what happens to the power of the people if you vote and then the court now overturns the decision based on technicalities? And for me, ahead as we move forward in building our electoral democracy, important things for the court is question around neutrality, independence, and upholding the principles and values of democracy. Because if the court no longer is the hope of the ordinary citizen, then where lies the hope of the average citizen? And I think that is where the major challenge is. And the third and last point for me is around the redesign of institutions. And I believe that as Africans, I'm a strong Pan-Africanist, and I believe that we need to start that broader conversation on redesigning a democracy that captures the African values and that it's homegrown. So we don't need to copy and paste whatever we have from the West. Can we begin to have conversation inwardly? What is truly African, and how can we build systems that emphasize accountability, but most importantly, project Africa as a leader in the world? Because I do believe that we have the potential as a continent to be a leader and not just to engage with the West from a beggarly point of view, but it all begins with how we engage as a people within the continent. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. Thank you so much to all the three of you. Very rich discussion. Frankly, the summary is this in one sentence. Africa's democracy will continue to decline as long as citizens are not put at the center. And we keep injecting technology that we have no control over with interest from outside. And we need to redesign not only institutions, but even the democracy itself to fit the African context. Oya, I hand over to you. 5 minutes we still have for the next session. Thank you to my panelists. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, colleagues. Thank you to Prof. Maglosa for moderating the first panel. Great insights when we reflect on the various elections that have taken place on the African continent. Thank you to our three panelists for your insights and everyone that has engaged us on the matter. We are going to swiftly move to the second panel that will be now forecasting. The first panel was reflections on the elections and the political developments on the three countries and broadly the African continent speaking. Now the second panel is now going to look into the elections that are holding, that are supposed to be holding elections this year and next year. As I know that the poster had said that Mr. Terry Tselane was going to chair, However, he had his family emergency, there's a bereavement, and has unfortunately had to pull out. We are therefore going to ask the panelists in the second panel, Mr. Jack Zaba from the National Democratic Institute, to then play the role of both panelist and chair. So Mr. Jack Zaba is going to now present, and thereafter will then moderate the session going forward. He's a senior program officer from the National Democratic Institute in Zimbabwe, extensive experience in elections and political processes. Mr. Jack Zaba, over to you, sir.
And thank you to panelists from the first session. So I think this part, as Vusi has highlighted, will broadly focused into the upcoming elections in Zimbabwe, then upcoming elections in South Africa. So the three panelists and three speakers for this session will include myself talking about Zimbabwe and the expected elections in Zimbabwe. Like it's highlighted, I've basically have been working on elections in Zimbabwe over the past 17 to 18 years, but with wide-ranging experience observing or studying about elections in other countries across Africa. So this is an interesting platform for me as a practitioner. Mainly, I'm not from the academic landscape. I've been working in civic society mainly, or the non-governmental organizations, but still doing elections. Then the second panelist will be our good professor, Prof. Susan Booysen. She has a rich history as well. I think in one of my journeys professional, I have met her and read about what she studied or did surveys on elections, especially in Zimbabwe. Then the third panelist is Dr. Nomsa Masuku. Again, we will not read through her rich history, but I think it has been projected on the screen. We can all interact with that and get to understand her better during the conversations. So our presentations again will be 12 minutes for each of us. That will lead eventually into discussions. We really witnessed rich discussions in the earlier session. So we will start basically on Zimbabwe. Then after that, we will have Prof. Booysen and Dr. Masuku coming in. So without wasting much time, I will shift to my other role as a speaker and talk a bit in 12 minutes about Zimbabwe, basically looking at elections that are upcoming in Zimbabwe and the emerging dynamics and trends around these elections. So my first take is just background. You look at the fact that Zimbabwe has been holding elections since 1980 with almost 9 parliamentary elections, 6 presidential elections since 1980. And religiously, the country has been following the provisions of its constitution in terms of holding regular elections. Then we've had a lot of cycles in terms of the evolution of the election administration framework, evolution of the legal framework governing elections in Zimbabwe. And you will find that the tipping point or the historic point was the adoption of a constitution, a new constitution in 2013, that is May 2013, which has governed elections since 2013. We had another cycle of elections in 2018. And again, now we are facing a set of another round of general elections. So you find the new constitution then provided for a sort of tripartite elections, which provide for holding of elections at local authority, at national assembly level, and presidential on the same day or days if conditions change. So those elections were held in 2018, and the elections happened on the background of a transition that didn't involve elections. And this transition is usually called a military assisted transition, and others would prefer to call it a coup, but it's a question of terminology. But what was witnessed in 2017 was a change of government that did not come out of elections. 8 months later, we then had elections in July 2018. And one thing to pick from there as we shift focus into 2023 is there was massive voter turnout, about 85% people turned up to vote. But of course, the period following that had a lot of issues, and even the elections themselves had a lot of issues which needs to be improved, as highlighted by over 12 observer missions which were deployed for the 2018 election. So since 2018 up to now, I think there are a lot of things or positives which can be picked, and also negatives which emerged, and which we may need to track and follow as we get into 2023 elections. One of the things that I think can highlight is the ratification of the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance. This happened in 2021 in November. I think basically at a principles or norms and standards level, this was something which was commendable. A lot of electoral stakeholders highlighted the importance of doing that. Politically, it's an indication that we have a government willing to reform in a particular fashion consistent with what the region may be desirous. So that happened in 2021. Then following that, there were some attempts to amend the laws consistent to recommendations from observer missions. Part of those reforms which are currently incomplete at that stage is the maybe expansion and extension of the women's quota provisions and expanding it to local government. Initially, it was at the National Assembly level. But the biggest thing that emerged was maybe an attempt to amend the public order laws and the media freedom laws, which were some of the major recommendations from the observer mission. But if you look at analysis from a lot of stakeholders, it tells you that that kind of reform was either inadequate or still incomplete to be able to satisfy necessary conditions for elections in 2023. So I will just highlight about 4 critical aspects that need to be followed in terms of emerging trends. And I really enjoyed listening to trends or whatever happening in other countries, Kenya, Nigeria, and I smiled looking at some of those issues. Really have lots in common with what is obtaining in Zimbabwe. So the first thing I want to highlight will be around the aspect of reforms and the lethargy that is associated with the attempt to reform the electoral processes. I'll speak also about the shrinking democratic space and some sort of criminalization of civil society work. Then I'll also go to the aspect of election management itself in terms of how its current state may be an impediment to electoral integrity as we get to 2023 elections. Then I'll also speak a bit about the role of the judiciary and the election dispute resolution mechanism. So I'll just highlight those four and maybe look at how money is playing a role in politics and in shaping or manipulating the citizen choice. So in terms of reforms, we are looking at a situation where, despite being a catalog of recommendations from observer missions in 2018, there's been lack of political will. That political will has been missing in terms of pushing, advancing such kind of reforms that were needed in terms of improving the electoral architecture. So that unwillingness is actually captured in some phrases which emanate from senior government officials or party officials who go on and tell you that we can't reform ourselves out of power. And it's reflective in the lack of action at a legislative level in terms of pushing a reform agenda. So we are left with conditions which obtained largely in 2018, if not getting worse in terms of the political environment. And linked to that, you then find that the country is immersed in a sustained effort to really close the democratic space. You'll find that if you compare it, the period from November 2017 to July 2018, Zimbabwe witnessed what many would prefer to call a honeymoon in terms of enjoyment of fundamental freedoms, allowing people to campaign, allowing civil society to do their work of promoting awareness or sharing information. So that has been missing, and again, we've seen use of law. There's a current bill before the president, which if signed would criminalize a lot of civil society work. That is really essential, which is essential in terms of promoting participation in the elections. Then the other aspect which we need to follow is the weakened and fractured election management body. The Electoral Commission is really, in recent months, has shown that there is a huge element of discohesion, which resulted in some commissioners taking part or signing affidavits where they dissociated themselves from a recent electoral boundary delimitation exercise, which had so many issues in terms of transparency levels, in terms of compliance with the Constitution. So you have 7 out of 9 commissioners doing typically what also happened in Kenya in the past election, where they broke ranks with their other commissioners in terms of discrediting whatever process they had managed. So that again is something Zimbabwe is staring at, and going into an election, you have a fractured election management body, which really dents any hopes or any trust in terms of them being able to handle elections in the next 4 or 5 months. Then the other aspect I need to highlight before my 12 minutes come to an end is the aspect of ineffective electoral justice system, where there's huge mistrust in the judiciary, and some have gone to the extent of providing evidence that would show elements of judiciary capture. And on the other hand, you also have the same judiciary being burdened with the election dispute resolution mechanisms. So most of the aspects of EDR or election dispute resolution are channeled to the judiciary. But this is the same judiciary which most citizens have lack of trust on. So again, this provides a black spot as we get to the next election. I will highlight the last 2 aspects. The one of it, there's been a sustained degradation and criminalization of opposition politics in general. So in recent months, you've seen most of the opposition parties' activities, including rallies, including appearance on national TV, has been really banned. So you find an opposition failing to hold a rally, but you also find opposition leaders being incarcerated, something akin to the colonial era where you have opposition leaders detained without a trial. We have one of the prominent leaders who is reaching almost a year in prison without trial. Then lastly, I think one trend and one thing Zimbabwe may teach the region is the embeddedness of the military in electoral politics. Historically, you have a country which emerged from a gruesome liberation war struggle, but the same fighters transitioned easily, seamlessly into government, and they've been holding fort and sustaining the hegemony. So at any given point, you still have electoral politics really impeded by the overbearing presence of the military in civic spaces, in government spaces. So you have them embedded and with vested interests. Some of them will even appear as candidates at some point. Some will seamlessly transition from the barracks to government offices. So that has created a lot of mistrust in electoral governance in general, because most citizens now feel, even if you participate in an election, that essentially will not lead into any alternation of power or transfer of power. So it may lead to massive disillusionment and apathy in the 2023 election. So I think being chair as well, I will allow myself to end here, and if there are any further discussions to my few highlights, we will proceed through the plenary discussion. So I will quickly then ask Professor Booysen to come in and make a presentation. I suspect we are comfortable with having the three panelists speak, then we have our questions.
Thank you, Mr. Zaba, and fellow panelists across this event. Such a privilege to join in this forum with people from across the continent. And yes, Mr. Zaba, it was fascinating to listen to Zimbabwe. So many striking similarities in the processes, even if it is different phases of post-liberation politics, even if multi-party politics in many and elections, in quite a few respects, take different routes comparing South Africa and Zimbabwe. There are a few striking similarities, and I think they will emerge as I give you. It's going to be a very brief overview of the political landscape at this stage in South Africa, especially the pre-2024 electoral landscape, when we know elections are probably to be expected around late April, early May 2024, that is national and provincial elections in South Africa. And those will be the sixth set of national and provincial elections taking place post-1994 liberation moment in South Africa. Well, as everybody around this meeting probably knows, South Africa is never short of dramatic moments and dramatic transitions, benchmark transitions in our politics, even if it is within the broad parameters of electoral contestation and a particular form of multi-partyism that has come to characterize South African electoral politics, and that is really one-party dominance within quite a vibrant multi-party democracy system, but a vibrancy that has been so far and possibly will continue to be into 2024, not a type of vibrancy that directly challenges the ANC in its continuous dominance. As I'll allude to in a few minutes, even if the ANC is at this dramatic moment, at the point of the forthcoming election, of possibly losing an outright majority at the national level and at several provincial levels across South Africa's 9 provinces, it still retains overall quite an edge of, let's say, 20 to 25% over the biggest opposition party. More of that in the next few minutes. I will briefly, in this quick presentation, talk about electoral trends and expectations regarding turnout, the expectations of the results that we can see in next year's elections, and then just take stock of so many of the sentiments that we have also heard about in relation to the other countries in both these panels. Trust, distrust, cynicism, loss of hope, elections without choice. Many of these phenomena are very profound at this moment, perhaps more than ever since 1994 in South Africa. So that will be a quick few points in my input here. First, of course, I mentioned 2024 as a likely benchmark turning point in South Africa's electoral history of one-party dominance within multipartyism. And yes, we can just reflect back as a few of these previous moments. 1994, of course, was such an important moment for the ANC in its negotiated transition and elections that were part of that transition. And the ANC would have gained exceptional powers had it gained that 66 or 2/3 majority in those elections, which would have entitled it. It got to that point later on, but didn't use it. But a 2/3 majority would have entitled it to make quite far-reaching changes to the just negotiated Constitution of South Africa. It ended up in 65 point decimals, a percentage of the vote. And many people still speculate to this day as to whether that was a real or a manufactured outcome, because the fact that the ANC did not get the 2/3 majority in that election meant that there was quite an appeasement of right-wing and reactionary and conservative and former Bantustan politicians and political interests in the country. It was reassuring to many of those parties that the ANC had not gained that majority. So 1994 in own right was a pivotal moment there. And then, of course, the ANC, their hopes were high, optimism was fabulous in South Africa. And the ANC economy also continued growing quite well. And the ANC went up to a percentage just short of 2/3 in a following election with the help of the, then it still exists, but even smaller than then, Minority Front, that small, largely ethnically based party from KwaZulu-Natal. The ANC did get a 2/3 majority, but didn't really use that majority to effect dramatic legislation or constitutional changes. And then the ANC in own right, of course, grew to, in 2004, to that 69.69% of the vote, which was the peak at which the ANC started turning around. It was a large 2/3 majority, but by then, at that time, other issues started holding the ANC back, and it did not have the political will to forge dramatic, far-reaching changes. Also because probably it had become more pro-business, business-aligned, and it largely operated by some precepts of expectations of the international political economic institutions and its balance of payments, etc. And then, of course, after subsequently, the game started changing as the ANC precipitously started declining in its support. And to the point of, in 2016, for example, losing major metropolitan governments across the country. And that trend consolidated dramatically in 2021. Those local government elections of almost 2 years ago by now. And there was that small point in between in 2019 in national elections when Cyril Ramaphosa as president just took over from former President Jacob Zuma. And there were huge expectations that things are really going to change. Government is really going to be more responsive, more able to take care of the needs of South Africans. But that did not quite happen. That moment, what they called in South Africa, Ramaphoria, that euphoria of Ramaphosa's ascent into power, has by now quite completely dissipated. And these illustrations just briefly to show, yes, there have been other definitive moments in South African electoral politics, very crucial moments, but often they slipped by quietly and in the end did not mean that much. But then now we get in South Africa to this point of ANC possibly losing at national level and at some provinces, including those crucial provinces of KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng, losing outright majorities in those governments, and what that does to politics in South Africa. We have to consider here that the ANC is not guaranteed by all current opinion polls, and there are quite a few available. I mentioned them briefly. It is no guarantee at this stage that the ANC will slip below 50%, although the chances are pretty good. If we take the electoral trends of decline since the time of 2009, those national elections where the ANC started dipping downward, ANC at national level has been declining on average in a region of 3 to 4, sometimes marginally over 4 percentage points declines per election. One cannot accept that the size of those declines will remain the same, but coincidentally, that has been the case in about 3 elections at national level, down 3 to 4 percentage points per election. At local government elections, there where we see many more of these coalitions emerging because ANC has slipped below 50%.
Yeah, reminder, Prof, we have 4 minutes left.
Thank you, I'll rush it. The ANC has been declining at local level at around 8 percentage points per election. So the decline locally has been far faster and steeper than at national level. And the ANC at the last election having had around approximately 57% nationally of the vote, if that proportion of decline persists, the ANC could very well still end up to above 50% of the vote, even if marginally so. However, despite that general trend, the public opinion polls, and there have been ones by the Social Research Foundation, by the Brenthurst Foundation, by the Rivonia Circle, several by the media company, research company Ipsos, that all indicate a performance in a range of between 42% and 52% in the next election. And it is, of course, difficult at this stage, more than a year before the elections, to say exactly, accurately who will vote, who will abstain, and how they will vote. Because a big trend in the way in which ANC has been keeping power across recent elections has been the performance of opposition parties. Opposition parties have largely aided the ANC in its retention of political power. There have been several projects of splits from the ANC and ANC manufactured micro parties over the years. We think of splits of Congress of the People, Economic Freedom Fighters. There have been other small parties like National Freedom Party in KwaZulu-Natal, the Independent Democrats, small parties that have helped the ANC retain power in crucial places. And this is a very big part of the ANC's current power game, where coalition government is one of the ways in which it retains power. Besides protests being very accommodative of protests and protests, South Africa is really a protest nation. We love protests, happening alongside the ANC and acting as a shock absorber in many respects, helping the ANC come election time to again retain support. So protest is there, now coalition politics is also there. And if we look at the scenarios as to ANC performance come 2024, we would be one, lower 40s, where the ANC really would need a bigger party like the economic freedom fighters, to help get it to retain government power. Even if shared in a coalition, perhaps with the EFF, many still think, and voters also like the idea of, to the equivalent extent, roughly as the idea of a coalition with the EFF. Voters are really split between those: coalition for the ANC with the DA, or with the EFF. And so those two possibilities are there if the ANC is in the lower 40s. If the ANC goes next year's elections above 45%, it could make do with a few what I call top-up parties, smaller parties that would be easier to manage as a coalition partner than economic freedom fighters for the ANC, easier to manage. And then one would obviously look at the model that we see unfolding in a pretty chaotic, I'll finish in a second, thank you, in a pretty chaotic local government coalitions where there is huge instability, very little focus on governance issues where those really get neglected. So those are the scenarios looking forward. If we look forward to the ANC and its performance come next elections. And it's very important to note that turnout in South Africa is still relatively high. And so there is shock absorption space there, but young voters are disproportionately disinterested nowadays in participating in elections. And that can create a high level of instability and uncertainty in South Africa. So yes, and the mood in South Africa is one of despondency, of disillusionment, and not having much hope that elections will really change anything. But South Africans still love their elections, and come the next election campaign in 2014, they will probably be available for mobilization again, although I expect the percentage participation again to go down in the next election. And overall, in a longer term, very strong implications for the legitimacy of the system and sustainability of multi-party democracy. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you so much, Prof, for the enlightening views. Yeah, in consideration of time, let's quickly move over to Dr. Nomsa.
Thank you very much, Chairperson, and good afternoon to everyone that is on the platform. May I thank my fellow panelists for making my job and my life much, much easier, because you've laid the ground for what it is that I've been asked to do. My brief for this afternoon is twofold. I've been asked to look at the changing patterns in voter behavior, and I thank Professor Booysen for touching on that in her concluding part of her input, and to also talk about the preparedness of the electoral management body in South Africa. May I please begin with a disclaimer? I do speak from the perspective of an election management body. And so that is the perspective that I'm going to bring to this conversation. I think maybe before I begin, because we do have a continental-wide audience, may I say what it is that in law, the Electoral Commission of South Africa is charged to do by the Constitution of South Africa. It is charged to do three things. The first one is that it is charged with managing elections of national, provincial, and municipal legislative bodies. It is also charged with ensuring that those elections are free and fair, and it is also charged with declaring the results of elections. The last point is not something that is often the same. It's not a responsibility that is carried by all the mentioned electoral management bodies on the continent. As you will have heard in the earlier presentations, sometimes the declaration of results is left to other bodies other than the election management body itself. I thought let me begin with the general trends of voter behavior. The Electoral Commission has research that it has been doing over a period of 20 years. It triangulates that research with other studies, notably Afrobarometer, which also came out around the time when we were looking at the longitudinal analysis of work that we've been doing over a period of 20 years. I want to highlight the following things that come from the study, but not dissimilar to what all my other colleagues have said across from the beginning of this session. The first one is that the research shows a loss of what we call internal political efficacy. That is the declining belief that the vote is going to make any difference. So in South Africa, for example, we see that it has dropped right down to 35%, where in 2021, where it rose from a low of 31% in 2020. That is, of course, results in a sharp drop in voter turnout, which my colleague, Professor Booysen, has spoken about. The sharpest drop was, of course, in 2021. And the features of that decline, as Professor Booysen has said, is mainly the alienation of young people and the growing gap of registration on the voters' roll between females and males. There's a 10% gap in registration on the voters' roll between male and females. The second feature that we see from the research is that there is what is called the external political efficacy. So generally in South Africa, there is a belief, a declining confidence or trust in the responsiveness of the political system. South Africans have a problem with the political system itself, and they are opting out of the system because they believe in what we call a certain show of fatalism. They're saying it doesn't really matter who you choose. Once those people have been chosen, they tend to behave in exactly the same way. The fourth factor that I want to point to is that characteristic with a democratic recession, in South Africa, we find that trust in the institutions that support democracy across the board is tracking downwards. That pull downwards is also affecting trust in the election management body itself. Even though the Electoral Commission of South Africa, compared to other institutions that support democracy, is still relatively high, it is declining, and it is declining at an alarming rate. The fifth one that I want to point out, which does not come out as strongly in the research that I'm alluding to, it is the corrosive impact of disinformation, particularly on social media. And what you find is that disinformation is perpetuated not just by the people that don't vote, but it is also perpetuated by the contestants themselves. In South Africa, also, I think what I want to mention before I exit this point, it is that the people that actually do turn out to vote. In South Africa, we have a voters' roll that has 26 million voters. The potential that eligible voters in South Africa are 52 million. So we have a growing gap. It's 16 million people that are eligible to vote but choose not to vote. In South Africa, you can't vote unless you have registered. That is a source of worry because that first step of being on the voters' roll is not being used, despite the efforts of the election management body to make registration easier, to make it, you no longer have to do it in person. We still don't see the dividends of that improvement. People still stubbornly stay away from the voters' roll. With that, I'd like to talk very briefly about the preparedness of the Electoral Management Commission of South Africa to host the forthcoming elections. As Professor Booysen has said, the term of the current administration is going to end sometime in 2024, and the window for running elections is between May of 2024 and August of 2024. It's a 90-day window. What we know is that the Apex Court in South Africa has said very clearly it does not have the appetite to have elections run outside that constitutional window. So we cannot say that in the event that there are any unforeseen delays, that we will approach the court again and ask for leniency on that time frame. We have to deliver that election within that 90-day framework. Why is that particularly important? It is important because in 2021, the Constitutional Court found that the Electoral Act is not constitutional because it prescribes that in order for you to stand as a candidate, you have to do so via a political party. The Constitutional Court, I am summarizing, said that if the right to stand for elections, and if you win, to represent, should not be reliant upon you being a member of a political party. And so the Electoral Act was found not to be constitutional. So the Constitutional Court asked the National Assembly to amend the Electoral Act. The National Assembly took a while to begin the process, and eventually, when it did, it has come up with an electoral amendment bill, which has recently been adopted by the National Assembly, which seeks to insert independent candidates into contestation. In other words, independents can now contest for elections, both at the provincial and national legislatures, without going through a political party. There are dissenting opinions that are there. The law is currently before the president. The president has had that bill in front of him for just over a month, if I'm not mistaken, and he has not yet assented to the law. The implications of that is that it is beginning to eat into the time that the Electoral Commission needs in order to prepare for elections. We don't have a law that you can use in order to prepare for those elections. And the longer that the period takes, the less time that the Electoral Commission has. It threatens the timeline that we need in order to prepare for delivering a free and fair election. There are challenges that we expect. We believe that even if the president assents to the bill and turns it into law, we are almost certain that it will be challenged in the Constitutional Court because there is a section of the population that read the directives of the Constitutional Court to mean an overhaul of the electoral system and is therefore unhappy that this particular bill has not done that. However, that having been noted, the Electoral Commission continues its preparations insofar as the law the bill that we have in place. In South Africa, most of our processes, save for balloting and completion of the results slip at a voting station, are online. So that includes delimitation of voting districts, voter registration, candidate nomination, etc., etc. The list is very long. And if I list all of that, I might not have time to conclude. So what we are trying to do is to do as much work as we can in the following areas that are impacted by the change in the Electoral Amendment Act. We need to develop a new system for quota requirements. So the quotas that independents are going to need and parties that have not contested before is going to be an issue, and we need to design a program that will do that for us. We'll have to rewrite the results system. We need to rewrite the candidate nomination system as well. We need to add an extra ballot. At the moment, in the past national elections, we've had 2 ballot papers. In the forthcoming elections, if the bill goes through, it's going to be 3. We have to increase the time that is necessary in the election timetable by approximately 29 days to allow for the production of the ballot paper and also candidate nomination. Then we also have to plan for full swing based on the act that is before the president. So in other words, plan for the minute detail. And then we have to roll out logistics, which has become routinized in the Electoral Commission of South Africa as we have run elections quite often. So if you ask me how ready are we? We are as ready as can be expected, given the uncertainty that we are facing because of the absence of a law that we are going to organize elections using. Chair, I'm going to stop there and I'm going to take comments and questions in the interaction. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Masuku, for your presentation. So we notice we have about 15 minutes, so we have a very, very, very tight plenary session. So I'll allow for quick questions in 5 minutes, then the last 10 minutes will be for closing comments or feedback from the panelists. I noticed there are some questions on the chat box, and I think our panelists will look at those and respond to them as well. So any quick questions in the next 5 minutes, if one can vocalize.
Mr. Zaba, we currently have no hands raised at the moment, but we have quite a few questions in the chat box.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Yes.
So I
just as a reminder, our webinar will finish at 6 p.m. So you do have a bit of time to engage with questions before we do the vote of thanks.
Oh, perfect. So we are fine. So I think as we wait for any other additional questions, I can see we have some questions on the
Q&A.
Yeah. Let me look at some of those. I think there's one which says, how do we in Africa explain the emerging trend of African politicians taking their campaigns to Europe and making America to Europe and America and seeking external validation of their aspirations? Then there's another one which concerns, is it possible to unkindly unpack what can be done to motivate citizen trust in electoral processes after the onerous challenges you mentioned, such as militarization of the whole process, lack of political will to instigate reforms, and criminalization of civil society work? Is there another third question?
Yes, there's one by Dr. Kaziboni, Dr. Anthony. This question is directed to you, Mr. Zaba. He says, within the ambience of democracy, how do you view the 2017 transition? The late former president, Robert Mugabe, described his unseating as a quote unquote coup.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I can see a couple of them directed at me. The other one is there enough incentive for Zimbabweans to go out and vote in numbers this year? What is the level of trust in the electoral system amongst citizens leading up to this year's elections? Okay, so do we have any other hands? Someone who may need to add one or two questions before we have a round of responses from the panelists?
We have one question for Dr. Masuka from Shingirai, who asks, what does your research at the IEC show regarding the disparities between voter registration according to gender? What interventions would you recommend to increase registration among women?
Thank you so much. Okay, so I think I can quickly respond to questions directed to me, then I defer to Dr. Masuku and Prof. Booysen. So in terms of Zimbabwe, there was one interesting question from Anthony Kaziboni, is it? Yeah. in terms of what happened in 2017, yeah, it has been a contestation of narratives, really, where on one hand you have those who follow the book of democracy, really measuring the transition in terms of the principles and norms of a democratic transition. So if you follow that really in all aspects and in whatever color, that really does not align with the principles of democracy. But then you have a narrative that is being advanced by those who actively instigated the transition, where they say it was above the law, and you then have a situation where that person was even presented to a high court, in which case the high court said it was constitutional. So if it's to my opinion, I think basically it falls outside the prisms of any democratic transition. But again, as I highlighted, it is always subjected to a contestation of narratives in terms of whether it was a coup, whether it was a military assisted transition. You do have a government which is very robust in terms of countering any narratives in that regard. Then there was the question of how do we motivate citizens in the electoral processes under the military no reforms and the criminalization of civil society work. I will attach that to question from Kanyiso Simelani in terms of saying, is there enough incentive for Zimbabweans to go out and vote in numbers this year? What is the real level of trust in the electoral system among citizens leading up to this year's elections? So you will find that, like I mentioned, in 2018, we had a very big rise in terms of voter turnout. 85% is by no means small number. It's really very impressive. But if you look at that context and looking at elections before the 2018 elections, you will realize that the context really allowed for voter turnout to flourish in 2018. This is because there were efforts really in a big way to open the democratic spaces. People were allowed to demonstrate. So the honeymoon, which I highlighted, really allowed for citizens to express themselves, and it reignited hope among citizens, and it reinvigorated the belief that possibly elections can be a way of expressing yourself or a way of changing or retaining a government. So the 85% was good. 5 years later, situations are different. In fact, 3 days after the July 2018 elections, we took a tailspin back into the old Zimbabwe in terms of political freedoms, starting with the infamous 1 August protest, which led into the unfortunate death of about 7 people being led by the state in terms of attack on those citizens. So from that moment up to this time, that honeymoon is over, and is indeed over, because 5 years now, no one is really enjoying the prospect of thinking of any demonstration. Even a labor-related demonstration will be heavily dealt with by the state. No one would think of anything. Even organizing meetings for civil society organizations has become really difficult, where the police services actively bar or use some unreasonable grounds to dismiss any part of civic action. So all that, and in the midst of no reforms, and in the midst of a situation where civil society work has actually been criminalized, because usually you would find that in terms of raising citizen awareness, it has been civil society at the forefront, of course, complementing the efforts of the Electoral Commission. But now we do have civil society, which is almost in a state of paralysis because of their work. Yes, the bill is still in transit to be signed as a law because it was passed by Parliament, but it's awaiting presidential assent. But there is probably fear among civil society leaders in terms of if that bill becomes law, then that will be doomsday. So in all that effort, it leaves citizens without any amount of motivation or enough information to really reinvigorate their trust in the electoral system. So the 5 years we have seen a backsliding, and prospects for another high turnout are really slim at the moment. We have seen a growing number of young people, especially who are facing serious economic challenges and are not allowed even to express themselves in any other way, are only left with an election, but they don't really believe from recent studies that the election may change anything after all. And then in relation to the trust on the electoral management body, there was a recent study by Afrobarometer. It actually showed a decline in trust and confidence in the electoral management body. It was below 50, but again, it has gone further down below 50. So a combination of all that will really culminate into the very, very low turnout from analysis being done by civil society organizations and other analysts from the academia in terms of prospects for voter turnout. So I think I will end there, then allow Dr. Masuku to come in. There was a question directed to her, then Prof. Booysen to respond to any of those issues raised on the platform.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to the colleague that posed the question. At the moment, there is the reasons for the gap between female and male registration are not immediately clear. We only see the fact that there is a gap of about 10% between registration of females and males, with females being more than males on the voters' roll, and also females tend to turn out more in elections. The reason for that, we've in the process of commissioning work that is not just quantitative, but rather qualitative in order to investigate that phenomenon. In terms of motivating women to register, I think the Electoral Commission motivates everyone to register as well. We do focus on youth, we do focus on women. But I think the lessons that are coming out of research are telling us something slightly different. When the sharp drop in voter turnout happened in 2021, the response of political players was, what is the Electoral Commission of South Africa doing? And they place the duty to motivate people to vote on the electoral management body. I think that is a fallacy. It is a fallacy because the electoral management body is not on the ballot paper. So our job is to make sure that we continuously improve our processes and systems so that they don't become a deterrent to a potential voter. And that is borne out, I think, by the surveys that we do, which show that the people that do actually experience voting, they rate the Electoral Commission very high, but those that don't have a different perspective. Where I think there is a problem is just the general participation of women in politics. As I said, maybe in passing in my input, I think the problem is the unhappiness with the political system, and the fact that I think not enough scrutiny is put on political parties. There's a lot of scrutiny on the election management body, as there should be, but I think political parties and independents, whatever contestants they are not taken to task. There are comments about, oh, there's no accountability, etc., etc. But I think it is a shortcoming that people ask for accountability post facto, as opposed to working towards accountability in between elections. And I think that is the comment that I'd like to offer this meeting. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Masuku. Prof Booysen.
Thank you very much, Chair. Just one or two brief remarks. One comment and general question which really articulated with the case in South Africa and elections 2024 was what can be done to motivate voters to continue participating or to elevate their participation. Here, what I see in South Africa at this stage is a very astute, very cynical, very disillusioned electorate. And I really believe that their motivation to go out and participate can only be delivered to them in a form of action by government. Or, the various political parties govern in different places. For example, there has to be concrete evidence by government that it is there in service of the people, that its representatives actually are delivering service, and delivering service in a way infused with integrity, because voters really see a lot of dishonesty, a lot of corruption. Perceptions of corruption in government are increasing at this stage in South Africa too. So voters will be looking for that. And what the ANC offers in return as a predominant governing party, also national level, is there's a big gap between what they offer and that which think what voters are demanding. The ANC offers high-level narratives of continuous disadvantagement due to the past in South Africa. Some of it is valid, some not. They try to build hope. It's really ANC as a hope factory at this stage. Hope in voters' minds that things are improving. But then ANC comes with, I believe, insufficient narratives of there's a plan, they are taking steps. South Africa and government has started turning the corner. The miracle must be somewhere around the corner. So they really try to infuse that hope that they've got a plan and things will just take time. But voters have been hearing that since about 1995, when we first saw the evidence of impatience with when are the promises and where are the constitutional undertakings? Where are they and when are they going to come true? So I see a huge gap growing there with a very astute citizenry who may very well elect to vote in far lesser numbers than before, even if comparatively turnout will remain high. Thank you very much, Chair and fellow panelists.
Thank you, Prof. For responding to those questions. Do we still have any other questions?
We have one question in the Q&A box for Prof. Booysen.
Oh, is it? Can you assist in reading that out?
No problem. It says, what do you make of the, in quotes, national shutdown on Monday in projecting EFF's prospects in the 2024 elections?
Okay, thank you. Over to you, Prof.
Thank you very much, and thanks for that very difficult question. I think the shutdown or the protest cut both ways. It certainly helped elevate the EFF in national mind. I think it was effective for the EFF in terms of speaking to their own constituency and raising their own profile in a phase pre-election that's crucial to their general visibility in politics and society. And they definitely try to associate with all the predominant issues that are in voters' minds. So I think to some extent that would have been successful for the EFF. However, we also saw a big backlash against the EFF, and particularly noted by as civil society, where the EFF's original and maybe major mobilization orientation of threatening the alternative of violence should the shutdown, attempted shutdown or protest not be supported. So I don't think it will serve the EFF well to have had that as part of their repertoire. And they were really seen to be taking a step back in when it became evident that state and government are prepared to mobilize part of civil society, including private security companies, to quell any disruption should that happen. And I think the ANC has been quite reasonably effective in delegitimizing the action and in building the ANC's own legitimacy as being challenged unreasonably by the EFF, as the ANC projects that wanted to disrupt and bring or further bring the economy to its knees. So, and the ANC has been very effective in the last 2 days to make good propaganda out of it, out of the fact that there was no shutdown and that the EFF was had been on some dubious mobilizational grounds. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof, for the responses. Okay, I see we have no further questions either on the chat box or from the panelists. I think Vusi, I can safely hand over to you to proceed with the session.
Thank you so much, Mr. Zaba. Thank you, Prof. Booysen and Prof. Booysen and Dr. Masuku for your insightful and very rich insights on the forthcoming elections, both in Zimbabwe and in South Africa. Without further ado and waste of time, I'm going to invite Dr. Taylor from the Institute of the Future for Knowledge, IFK, our partner institute, who's going to do reflections on what has been discussed here today. Dr. Taylor, over to you.
Good afternoon, chairs, distinguished speakers and participants in South Africa and across Africa. My name is Oluwaseun Taylor at the University of Johannesburg's Institute for the Future of Knowledge. In a period packed with many elections in Africa, Kenya went to the polls in late 2022. It was Nigeria's turn last month. Zimbabwe will conduct its elections later this year, while Tunisia and South Africa's elections will be held in 2024. Against this backdrop, this webinar sought to examine the electioneering processes in these key countries and their implications for sustainable development in Africa. Barring Zimbabwe, these countries are regional powers. Accordingly, the results of these elections will not only influence the political trajectories of these countries, but also have wider implications for Africa and further afield. The crux of this meeting can be interpreted from the prism of two levels of analysis. First, national, second, continental. In terms of the continental message, as one of the chairs, Professor Kabele, and the speaker on Tunisia noted, it is important to examine the elections in Africa within the context of Africa's positions on critical issues such as COVID-19 and the Russia-Ukraine crisis. It is also noted that African democracy should reflect African values and realities. At the national level, the speaker on Nigerian elections noted that elections do not necessarily translate to democracy, seen in how Nigeria's political parties' primary elections were exclusionary and the electoral violence that characterized the presidential elections. While Kenya has a multi-party system, the country's democracy has been punctured by ethnicity and political violence, as political parties can be likened to ethnic associations. To mitigate this challenge, the speaker called for an Africanized institutional designs, most especially in the form of constitutional democracy. The speaker on Tunisia identified the rise of populist political parties and low level of political participation as the impediments to the country's democracy. The speaker on Zimbabwe highlighted some of the challenges experienced in the 2018 elections that are likely to manifest in the upcoming 2023 elections. Amongst others, these include a closed democratic space, a weak electoral body, as well as intolerance of opposition parties. The speakers on South Africa underscored the one-party dominant system in a multi-party democracy and argued that despite the challenges that confront the ruling African National Congress, the political party still has an edge over its competitors going into the 2024 elections. They, however, noted a declining trend in voter turnout, partly due to the alienation of the youth. From the discussion, it is clear that Africa still has a long way to go in a bid to organize free, fair, and credible elections. On behalf of the Institute for the Future of Knowledge and the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation, I thank you for listening. I will now invite Vusi Gumbi to give the vote of thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Taylor, for those important reflections on why we are gathered here today. Again, on behalf of both institutions, I'd like to thank firstly our chairs, our speakers who availed themselves out of the busy schedule to address us and really provide rich insights on African elections and political processes. And I think as we depart here today, what is important is inculcating a culture of ensuring that as African citizens, communities understand that we engage the electoral process routinely, not only after every 4, 5, or 6 years, depending on the presidential terms or administration terms, ensuring that citizens on the ground are able to engage their political leaders and familiarize themselves with the political processes and governance institutions of their respective countries. This is particularly important for our democracy to mature and to be consolidated. I'd like to thank both Dr. Taylor and Dr. Kinola for providing us the opportunity to host this event at their respective institutions and their directors. I'd like to thank the rest of the team behind the scenes that was involved in making sure that this webinar becomes a success. My colleagues, Ratizo Makombe, Nompumulelo Ndawonde, my colleague at IFK, Tandega Nomvele, and the rest of the colleagues at both institutions. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I appreciate the insights that were provided here today. Thank you. Dr. Kinola, over to you, sir.
Thanks, and I'm just waving to everybody to say thank you and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
The University of Johannesburg, the future reimagined.